All right, awesome. Good evening and welcome to our Voices Florida Coalition. We have a wonderful event for you tonight. I'm Natasha Sutherland, Deputy Director for Florida Watch, and I'll be your host this evening. Tonight's program is called Honoring Our History, Shaping Our Future. Because in order for us to know where we need to go, we have to first understand where we've been. We have an incredible lineup of speakers tonight that will discuss attacks on the freedom to vote, legislative actions on targeting Black history in the state, and what we can do to fight back. But first, let me introduce our speakers. We have Debbie Chandler, a native Floridian, who is co-president of the League of Women Voters of Florida. She's an attorney who worked for over 20 years as an assistant public defender in Palm Beach County. She has also taught constitutional and criminal law at Florida Atlantic University as an adjunct professor. Next, we have Amy Keith, Executive Director of Common Cause Florida. Amy joined Common Cause in 2022 with over 2 decades of nonprofit management, advocacy, and coalition building experience. And prior to joining Common Cause, she led election protection, voting rights, and civic education initiatives for the League of Women Voters. Next, we have Dr. Jill Lewis Spector, who is the first vice president of the League of Women Voters of Florida and chair of the League's statewide education action team, as well as Sarasota's team. She's professor emerita of New Jersey City University and past president of the International Literacy Association. Next, we have Brad Ashwell, who is the Florida State Director for All Voting is Local. Brad has more than 15 years of state and federal legislative experience with nonprofit advocacy groups working to improve election administration systems and voter access. And last, but certainly not least, we have State Senator Chevron Jones, who's a teacher, nonprofit leader, and longtime public servant who has dedicated his life to serving his community. Born and raised in Miami Gardens, Senator Jones is the first openly gay Black person to ever serve in the Florida Senate, where he's been a powerful advocate for public education and the issues that matter to the people of South Florida. So, as you can see, we have a packed lineup of wonderful speakers. So, we're going to go ahead and get to it. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Senator Jones. Actually, we're going to go ahead and go to Debbie first while we wait for Senator to join us. Debbie, on to you. Thank you for your patience.
Thanks, Natasha. Voting is fundamental to our democracy, and Florida has a long history of felon disenfranchisement. But is it right to tell people with felony convictions who are now law-abiding, raising families, working, and otherwise being good citizens that they cannot vote and actively participate in their democracy? Many of the disenfranchised are veterans. Members of the public are often surprised to learn what historians have long understood, that American felon disenfranchisement is a vestige of slavery and racism that can be traced directly back to the end of the Civil War. Next slide, please. From the end of the Civil War until 2018, Florida's Constitution included a lifetime ban on voting for persons with felony convictions. Only a grant of clemency could restore the right to vote. But before 1868, Florida's Constitution, including its Confederate Constitution, did not include this sweeping ban. It was largely silent on the issue of felon voting, leaving the issue up to the legislature. But consider this: the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 to extend citizenship to all people born in the United States, including the freed slaves. But Florida's legislature refused to adopt it until the federal government stepped in and demanded that Florida adopt a new constitution that would conform with the 14th and 15th Amendments and provide for manhood suffrage. After several tries, the Florida legislature finally adopted a new constitution enfranchising African American men while disenfranchising persons with felony convictions. At the same time, many petty crimes were recategorized as felonies, including types of larcenies, which had the effect of disproportionately impacting African American men. This was part of a larger scheme to reduce the voting power of newly freed slaves. At the same time, the Florida legislature introduced educational requirements for new voters, which did not apply to men who had voted prior to 1868. We'll never know how many people could not vote, but we know that felon disenfranchisement and other efforts at voter suppression silenced Black voters for decades. By 1940, according to the Tampa Bay Times article from 2013, it is estimated that as few as 3% of Black Floridians were registered to vote. Next slide, please. For almost 150 years, Floridians lived with one of the nation's harshest disenfranchisement laws. Estimates show nearly 1 out of every 4 disenfranchised citizens lived in Florida. Nearly 1.5 million had completed the custodial terms of their sentences, meaning they were no longer incarcerated. Disenfranchisement because of a felony conviction affects all races, but it impacts minority communities disproportionately. Florida had the highest rate of minority disenfranchisement in the nation. Next slide, please. A coalition of organizations led a bipartisan effort across the state of Florida to change the state constitution via the ballot referendum process. In the run-up to the 2018 election, petition gatherers across the state collected enough signatures to qualify for the November 2018 statewide ballot. Florida voters approved Amendment 4 by more than 64%. Next slide, please. In early 2019, the legislature, at its first session after the passage of Amendment 4, enacted Senate Bill 7066. This law requires the repayment of all fines, fees, costs, and restitution before voting rights are restored. Florida voters who approved Amendment 4 were told that there would be as many as 1 million new voters. The new law immediately disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of Floridians because of unpaid monies relating to their convictions. Of the 1.5 million Floridians with felony convictions, the Sentencing Project estimates 935,000 have completed their sentences, but have not paid their costs, fines, fees, or restitution. The day the legislation was signed by Governor DeSantis, multiple federal lawsuits were filed. Excuse me. The suits were won at the trial level, but reversed on appeal at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Today, persons with felony convictions cannot vote until all of their financial obligations relating to their convictions have been paid. In Florida, these costs imposed by judges at the time of sentencing fund the local court systems and jails and are quite steep. It is very difficult, even for trained legal professionals, to determine if all legal financial obligations have been paid. Florida has 67 counties. Each county has a different clerk of court. The clerks keep their own records, and they were not standardized until recently. In some of the smaller counties, records were not computerized until the 1990s. Couple that with the fact that Florida has seen its share of natural disasters like hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and fires, you can see the difficulty in checking sentencing records. Additionally, many of Florida's returning citizens are unsure of their records or when and where the crimes were committed. Next slide, please. This uncertainty did not stop the Division of Election Security from making felony arrests of people who thought they could vote, and even had voter registration cards issued by the Supervisor of Elections. Interestingly, when the primarily minority returning citizens voted by mistake, they were often arrested sometimes by SWAT teams in the middle of the night. Helicopters sometimes circled overhead, and uniformed police officers often brandished guns. They were charged with felonies and often actively prosecuted. Compare that, if you will, to the white voters of the Villages, a conservative enclave northwest of Orlando, who were invited to turn themselves into the sheriff for intentionally voting twice. These intentional violators were given diversion programs, which, when completed, were wiped from their records. Next slide, please. And the assault on voting in elections continues to this day. The legislature continues to pass laws limiting access to the polls, preventing 3PVROs, third-party voter registration organizations, from registering voters and thwarting fair districts, allowing legislators to pick their voters rather than having voters pick their legislators, as our founding fathers envisioned. Consider SB 90, which targeted voters by reducing the availability of drop boxes. It required vote by mail requests to be made every election cycle and prevented friends or relatives from returning more than 2 vote by mail ballots. Next slide, please. SB 524 banned ranked choice voting and required voters to respond to address confirmation requests or risk removal from the rolls. Targeted citizens. 524 targeted third-party voter organizations by increasing fines for inadvertent errors or late ballot turn-ins and restricting the returning of vote-by-mail ballots for voters. Finally, it targeted supervisor of elections by prohibiting the use of private donations for election administration. Next slide, please. The latest attack on voters and voting rights organizations in Florida comes from SB 7050, which made it so onerous to be a third-party voter registration organization that many groups, including the League of Women Voters of Florida, with a very long history of registering voters in the state, stopped being a third-party voter registration organization and no longer registers voter using paper applications. It is especially detrimental to minority communities because the 3PVROs routinely work in minority neighborhoods to assist with voter registration. According to the Democracy Docket, people of color are 5 times more likely to rely on third-party organizations to register to vote than whites. SB 7050 builds on SB 90, requiring organizations to re-register every election cycle. It prohibits pre-filled information on registration applications. It shortens time periods, significantly increases fines, and bans certain felons and non-citizens from registering voters. There are additional restrictions in the law, but the important thing is that it is a concerted attack on voters and voter registration organizations. And while it appears we may survive the current legislative session without additional restrictions, we can be sure the legislature will be back with more voter suppression laws for the foreseeable future. And now back to Natasha.
Thank you so much, Debbie. It's really, really important for us to understand the historical background behind, voting rights here in this country. Next, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome State Senator Chevron Jones to provide some remarks for us this evening. Senator?
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's definitely good to be here with you all today. I am just getting off the floor, so I apologize for my tardiness, but I'm so happy for this conversation that we're having and honoring our history and definitely shaping our future. If you have been paying attention to what has been happening in Tallahassee over the last 2 years, you know that there's been a fight in preserving our history and teaching our history to our children and ensuring that we maintain a steady hand and how that is being delivered, not not only to our young people, but for generations to come. And so I'm grateful for even being here today. I also am grateful that for this convening of this important discussion that we're having, because throughout our nation's history, Black Americans have displayed incredible courage, has displayed incredible creativity, has displayed incredible resilience, making innumerable contributions to the American story. Because I think we all can agree that when we talk about Black history, it is American history. And it is imperative that we take time to honor the accomplishment of those who have come before us, reflecting upon the suffering of our past while also facing the injustices that persist in communities across Florida and across this country. Black history is American history. History is not stagnant. I must say that again. Our history is not stagnant. When I was an educator, I reminded my students that we constantly learn new information about the past that influences our future. And it is our responsibility to ensure that the days, months, and years ahead, it reflect the lessons we can take from past victories, that it shows past traumas and past uncertainties. For us to truly live up to our country's ideals of liberty and justice for all, we need to learn from our past, not ban the conversations about it. We all can agree that there are good parts of our history and there are bad parts of our history, but all of it needs to be expressed. It needs to be learned and taught in a very accurate and real way. And the policies that we've seen over the last several years from Governor DeSantis and his allies in the legislature, they are clear attempts to rewrite history and spread a fake narrative about actual historical events. What they're trying to do is manufacture a problem to quote unquote solve, but it's an attempt to distract from the actual issue that's facing our schools, a distraction from the actual issue that's facing our community. And I truly believe as a state, we're struggling with a massive teacher retention issue. Simply put, Florida can't find enough teachers to replace the ones that's leaving. Why? Because Florida is moving further and further away from doing and governing to ensure that we are educating children in the correct and accurate way. And teachers are sick of being beat up on. In the last 4 years, the number of teacher vacancies has more than tripled. And this isn't a coincidence. You know, I've served in both Florida House and in the Senate for the past decade, and not once has a constituent come to me with a problem caused by quote unquote wokeism. Not one. And that's actually baffling to me, because that also goes to show that we have totally lost our way. And that is a call my office has never received when it comes to some of these things that we're seeing today. We hear about the affordability crisis. We hear about housing. We hear about healthcare access. We hear about the mom who's living in her car and needs to find housing for her and her children. And rather than coming to the table to discuss the real solution to these issues, sadly, there are many in Tallahassee who want to play more political games than making sure that we do what's right for the people. They would rather lead efforts to rip away basic freedoms, ban books, curtail laws meant to protect people from gun violence, and stand in the way of real progress. They want to ban discussions of Black history and other important subjects from our schools and workplaces. And they're worried these conversations might make students and employees feel uncomfortable. Let's think about that. When we're talking about our history, when we're talking about Black history, you're trying to make individuals comfortable for a very uncomfortable situation that many Blacks live through. The lynching that Blacks live through, the segregation that Blacks lived through, the redlining that Blacks went through. All of that was uncomfortable, and you're trying to make it comfortable for children or for students. No, we have to teach the truth. We have to teach it in its totality. But unfortunately, parts of our history should make people feel uncomfortable. Our country has had too many dark marks in its past. By putting on rosy colored glasses, we're not protecting students. We're guaranteeing history will repeat itself because we don't want to teach what's right. Floridians are definitely sick and tired of the games. They deserve real solutions to these real various problems that I'm talking about. And I truly believe we as a state, we are at a crossroads. And I believe that it's up to each of us to do our part to stop these attacks on education while also advocating for our community. being vigilant on the attacks of our rights, and remembering that our past informs us more than it defines us. It's critical that we all ensure our voices are heard in the upcoming elections by confirming our registration and staying informed about our voting options. Right now, even in this legislative session, while it might not have seemed as if it has not been on fire as it has been in the past 2 or 3 years, we still have missed the mark in governing, ensuring that we do what's right for Floridians. It's critical that we all ensure that we do our part outside of this process, outside of these walls in our community, because truly voting is truly the cornerstone of our democracy and the essential right upon which everything rests. We must do our parts to fight voter suppression and politicians' attempts to put up new obstacles to registration and cutbacks on early and mail-in voting. Beyond elections, we must stay engaged in the fight and hold bad actors accountable. During the legislative session and beyond, we cannot give up in this fight that we're in right now. My urge and my call to you is to continue to contact legislators, contact local elected officials, and others in our community to share your concerns and make your voices heard. Because I know sometimes it feels like it's a losing battle, but we actually do win when we show up. And that's how we'll ultimately build stronger, safer, and healthier communities where every Floridian can actually thrive. I know that you all are sick of having to come to the Capitol week after week, month after month, year after year, fighting for the legislature to do what's right. I think that we are chipping away slowly at getting back to governing because the pendulum is definitely swinging. I'll share with you, like I shared with a group of individuals who came today with Equality Florida. It was a group of our trans men and women and our non-binary and non-conforming individuals. And I'll say this, that I believe that we can win, but we have to show up. We cannot sit on the sidelines and wait for anybody to come save us because no one is coming to save us. No one. And I also say this last thing. It is an old saying, and it still remains true to this day, that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. I'm sick of being on the menu. I know that you are too. That's why I'm so happy that many of you have pulled up a seat at the table, even when they don't want to give us one. And that is the only way that we're going to see a change in what's happening in the state and across this country. And I repeat again, the pendulum is swinging, but we have to keep showing up. Thank you all for this opportunity, and I look forward to seeing you on the battlefield because we have a lot of work to do.
Senator, always a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks. Very much inspiring and really hopefully lighting a fire under all of us with the work that we have to do. So I really appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move to the next part of our presentation. We're going to pass it on to Amy.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Senator Jones. Always a tall order to follow Senator Jones, but I will try. As we just heard from Debbie and from Senator Jones, there is a long and a living history of racial discrimination with respect to voting in Florida. And since the passage, we can go to the first slide there. Since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, in addition to, we've seen in the history, we've seen de facto literacy tests, we've seen poll taxes, we've seen violence, we've seen voter roll purges, we've seen methods of voting that are popular with Black voters being cracked down on. But since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, discriminatory apportionment or redistricting has also been a key, if somewhat more subtle, means to disempower Black voters in elections when we're choosing our representatives. And we know that representation matters. And one of the clear impacts of all of this has been on representation. Because as a result of all of this discrimination and disenfranchisement of Black individuals and entire Black communities, there were no Black congressional representatives from Florida between 1877 and 1992. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how this problem has happened and is also coming back to us. So I had mentioned discriminatory apportionment. That's a lot of wonky jargon for you. So what exactly is that? And what exactly is this problem? Basically, we're talking about gerrymandering. Redistricting refers to the process of redrawing our voting districts so that the population is fairly apportioned and you don't end up with one giant district and one tiny district population-wise. Gerrymandering is what we call it when redistricting maps are drawn to purposefully give an advantage to a particular group or political party. We can go to the next slide to see a bit of a diagram of this. So the two main ways of gerrymandering are cracking and packing. Now, on this little chart, you'll see number 2. So cracking is example number 2 here. That means that we're taking the voters of a certain group and we're dividing them up across multiple districts to weaken their voting power. So they don't really have a say in any district. And you can see here in example 2 how the red voters don't win any districts. Now, packing is example 3, so all the way on the right side. It is the process of packing all the voters of a certain group into as few districts as possible. So this gives them voting power in a small number of districts, but it weakens their voting power over districts across districts overall. So you can see here that even though 60% of the voters in this scenario are blue, blue only wins 2 districts, but red wins 3. So that is a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about cracking and packing communities in Florida in order to affect the power they have and their ability to elect a representative. Another important concept in redistricting to understand is the concept of an opportunity district. So what that refers to is a district where a minority group is large enough that they have the opportunity to elect the candidate of their choice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a district where the minority group makes up a majority of the voters. It can also be a district where other voters cross over and they vote with the minority group and enable the minority group to elect the candidate of their choice. So that was a whole lot of technical stuff in a very short period of time about what redistricting and gerrymandering is. So we're going to the next slide. And we're going to talk about what happened in 2022. So what happened when Florida, like all states, was required to redistrict its congressional districts after the results of the 2020 census? And after a couple of rounds of map drawing and an unprecedented level of involvement by the governor, Florida's legislature passed a congressional map that halved the number of Black opportunity districts in Florida from 4 to 2 by cracking Black communities. In North Florida, the new map chopped up the old Congressional District 5, which had connected historically cohesive Black communities across North Florida who had elected a Black representative for years. And it split those communities up across 4 new districts. It cracked them into 4 new districts. Now, that new map was a map that the governor submitted after he rejected previous maps that had preserved a Black opportunity district in North Florida. And so the result, and putting this all into a historical perspective, that means that from, as we'll remember from earlier, 1877 to 1992, there was no Black congressional representatives from Florida. Then from 1992 to the year 2000, that should say to 2020. So from 1992 to 2020, a congressional district anchored in Jacksonville in North Florida elected a Black representative in every election until we get to 2022, where Black communities in North Florida were cracked across 4 districts, and all 4 of those districts now have white representatives. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit of what this looks like. You can see what the 2020 map was, and you can see that old Congressional District 5 that connected historically cohesive Black communities across North Florida, and you can see how that was broken up across 4 districts in the 2022 map. So that's what that looked like. So what did we do? Well, we sued. So we fight this battle at the ballot box, and we fight this battle in the courts. The League of Women Voters of Florida, Black Voters Matter, and Equal Ground sued in state court. Meanwhile, Common Cause Florida, the NAACP, and Fair Districts Now sued in federal court because we're going to fight this battle on all fronts. So let's talk first about the state. So while the government, it's on the next slide, we'll see, while the government of Florida has often used gerrymandering, as we've heard, to disempower voters, the people of Florida do not like gerrymandering. We know the people of Florida don't like it because in 2010, the people of Florida used a citizens initiative process to amend the state constitution to prevent gerrymandering. And the Fair Districts Amendment that we put in our constitution in 2010, those are the legal basis for the redistricting lawsuit in state court, which is called Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute v. Byrd, and that's the case that the league is a part of. So the Fair Districts Amendment has two levels of rules. The Tier 1 rules prohibit denying or abridging the equal opportunity of minorities to participate in the political process or diminishing their ability to elect representatives of their choice. It also prohibits political gerrymandering and the protection of incumbents, and it requires districts of contiguous territory. Now, the Tier 2 rules, which are subordinate, so less than the Tier 1 rules, they say that districts should be compact in shape and near equal in population, and that where feasible, district lines should follow existing political and geographic boundaries. So in their 2022 map, the legislator and the governor, they seem to be flipping these rules around and making Tier 2 more important than Tier 1. So with that 2022 map, what the legislator and the governor did is they blatantly ignored the will of Florida voters who demanded fair districts. And in that constitutional amendment that we put in the Constitution, prioritized protecting the representation of communities of color. And after back and forth rulings in lower courts, right now we're waiting for the Florida Supreme Court to take up that case. So that's what's happening on the state level as we try to fight this battle for representation. Now on the federal level, we'll look at the next slide. So I mentioned there's also a lawsuit about this same map in federal court. Common Cause Florida, the NAACP, Fair Districts Now, and a number of individual plaintiffs from across the state are suing Florida in federal court for intentional racial discrimination in violation of the US Constitution when they drew this 2022 map. So the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution says that no state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment says that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by any state on account of race. So when a state intentionally acts to diminish the voting power of a racial group in redistricting, both of these amendments have been violated. So this past September, we argued in federal court that the Florida legislature, at the direction of Governor DeSantis, intentionally weakened the voice of Black voters on the basis of their race, blatantly discriminating against them by taking away their right to fair and equal representation. And we argued that the DeSantis administration intentionally carved up Black communities across the state, and especially in North Florida, intentionally cracking them into multiple congressional districts to weaken their voice. And as we sat in that courtroom, we heard lawyers and witnesses for the administration feign ignorance and try to deny the shared experiences and challenges and history of North Florida's Black communities. We heard them question the existence of these communities as a community. And so in my last two slides, I'm going to show you a little bit why I found that so galling and why I think it's another example, like Debbie had mentioned, of that double standard about white voters and Black voters, and why this is another example, yet another example of the incredibly unfair tendency we have in Florida at the moment to have different rules for Black Floridians. So next slide, here we go. Here are those two maps again. And on the top, you'll see the 2020 map with the old District 5. And you can see that if you were to pick a location on one end of that orange district and the other end, you'll see that it goes roughly from a town called Jackson Bluff to Jacksonville, which on I-10 is 191 miles, according to Google Maps. So in court, the DeSantis administration argued that this isn't a cohesive Black community. It can't be a cohesive Black community. How could it be when it's nearly 200 miles long? And now let's take a look at the 2022 map on the bottom and look at that new District 2 in gray. Now that's the new district that comes right from that map that the governor and the legislator drew. And that district, if we pick one location on either end, goes from, let's see, Defuniak Springs to Lee, which again, driving on I-10 and according to Google Maps would be 192 miles. So the first one, which was not acceptable because of length, was 191, and the second one is 192. So I would ask, why is length a problem in one map and not the other? Why does the 150 plus year history of Black communities in North Florida get ignored due to the length of the district in one case, but no one even asks about the length of the district in the other case? Now, you might look at these maps and you might say, yeah, well, the new District 2 just makes more geographic sense. It looks better. So first, I'm going to note that the governor did veto maps that had a new District 5 that was more compact and centered in Jacksonville. But then I want to show you another part of the 2022 map that the governor approved. On the next slide, you can see on the left is the 2020 map, the old map for District 13, which includes, as you can see there on the left, all of St. Petersburg, and District 14, which is centered on Tampa. Then on the right, you can see the 2022 map, the same map drawn by the same people who apparently found that existing political and geographic boundaries were so important in North Florida. But what do we see here? We see the city of St. Petersburg cut in half, just 1 year after we elected our first Black mayor here in St. Petersburg, by the way. The city was cut in half, with the majority of the Black community packed in with Tampa on the other side of Tampa Bay. So if existing political and geographic boundaries are important enough to carve up Black communities in North Florida, why aren't they important enough to respect a giant body of water like Tampa Bay and two entirely different major cities? So in my opinion, I think it's because this wasn't about geographic and political boundaries at all. This is about power. And more importantly, this is continuing Florida's long history of disempowering Black voters in our elections. So thanks for sticking with me through that wonky bit of history and gerrymandering. And now I'll throw it on back to Natasha. Thanks.
Took the words right out of my mouth, Amy. Thank you so much for breaking down all these technical details so that folks have a better understanding of how representation really works. And also thank you so much for the fight that you all are in to ensure fair and equal representation for all of us. All right, so next we're going to pass it over to Jill. Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's been a great evening so far. Thank you. We want everybody who's eligible to vote, certainly. And we want every district to be reasonable in terms of the makeup of the district and that it's fair. But where does education come in? We want voters to be well informed. They need to make good decisions. We have 64% of our electorate not obtaining a college degree. So we're really dependent on our K-12 system of education to equip students with the tools and the skills that they need to make good choices, including choices they make as voters. They need to learn in school their responsibilities as citizens and the rights that our democracy affords them, so that democracy, our democracy, can be preserved and even improved. Next slide, please. Students are key observers. They spend a lot of time in school, and they have plenty of occasion to see when there's a difference in how people treat each other. Students notice things. Next slide, please. One thing they may notice is the difference in their school's resources, including the condition of the very buildings in which they are taught, as compared to others. A 2022 study of school resources found that on average, high poverty districts receive 12% less, or nearly $1,500 less per student than low poverty districts. The consequences for students attending such underfunded schools are significant. It not only affects student achievement, but it's also extremely challenging if we want to make students feel like they are important, like they belong. Let's look at some of the consequences that are listed here. When a school has less money, they tend to have less experienced teachers because they can't afford teachers with advanced degrees. Their classes tend to be larger. There are less support services for struggling readers or for English language learners. Students find school less satisfying, and graduation rates are lower, as are achievement levels. Next slide, please. Our young people are also witnessing how school policies, administrators, and teachers treat minority students. School dress codes often discriminate against natural hairstyles of many Black children and often results in a student being suspended from school. DEI programs, as you well know, have been eliminated in Florida's public schools. These programs are designed to help teachers and administrators understand how they are responding to minority children and to examine their own biases. They also have to take a look at how they can modify their responses so that all children are treated fairly, equitably, and without discrimination. Next slide, please. Minority children, Black and Hispanic students, are disciplined more severely than white students for similar behavior. This is another thing that all children in school are witnessing. They see this, and they also see children being hit with sticks and rulers in classrooms. And often it's the minority child who's experiencing corporal punishment. Why is corporal punishment still permissible in Florida's public schools? Next slide, please. Another thing that children in school are witnessing is the legislative gag orders on minority voices. Recent limitations on diverse viewpoints and historical truths, such as those that Senator Jones mentioned, deny students opportunities to think critically about complex issues. How can Florida's youth imagine a role for themselves in improving democracy when historical truths are withheld and these children don't even know that anything is wrong with it? Next slide, please. Senator Jones mentioned banned books, and Rudine Sims Bishop has spoken of books as windows that offer readers views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. Positive representations of diversity in children's books facilitate acceptance of cultures different from one's own. Books can also serve as mirrors, reflecting a child's own experiences. It can introduce culturally diverse children to characters that have similar experiences and emotions. This reinforces a distinct cultural identity and a sense of belonging. Florida's children are being denied these encounters as books written by and about minority groups are being challenged and removed from school library shelves. And these are some of the Black authors whose books have been removed. We know that there are poet laureates, Nobel Prize winners, whose material just isn't allowed in classrooms. Next slide, please. Students are also seeing their peers being attacked for having non-traditional sexual identity and sexual orientation. They are learning that this is okay to marginalize some people. And these marginalized students are left to feel like they don't belong. And if they feel that way, why should they care about preserving a system that makes them feel this way? Why should they vote? Why should they care if this kind of democracy is preserved? Next slide, please. Advocates will fight for positive change. And we need our young people to understand what that means and why it's so important for our democracy. Next slide, please. This slide lists some bills that are examples of what could be. These bills were proposed in this session's legislative session, but none of them will reach the governor's desk because there are too many legislators who want to go backwards and make things in Florida like they were 50 or 60 years ago, or even more. But some legislators, as you see here, do want to move forward and will continue to push for positive change. We will do the same. Thank you. And now back to Natasha.
Thank you so much, Jill, for helping us to understand how these policies affect disparities in our education for Florida's children and the significant impact that it can have on them. Okay, so next we will kick it over to Debbie.
Thanks, Natasha. The Voting Rights Act of Florida, I thought would, isn't Amy or Brad going to talk about this?
Yeah, I'm here
we
to
can
speak
pass
on the
it
Voting
over
Rights
to-
Act.
Sorry
Okay.
about that. Go ahead, Brad.
Well, does Debbie want to talk on 904? But okay, fine. I'll talk about the Harry T. And Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Voting Rights Act. Hi, I'm Brad Ashwell. I'm the state director for All Voting is Local Action. So I guess the first question is, why does Florida need a state voting rights act? You know, as Debbie described earlier, the league has been in the fight with us as Common Cause and other partners. The Florida legislature each year has passed bills that would harm and intimidate voters in a variety of different ways. These bills have all deliberately and explicitly targeted Black voters, Hispanic voters, youth voters, and erected barriers at the ballot box. Is Amy alluded to, this has all also been in the context of this array of efforts designed to disempower people of color and just really regular people, and marginalized folks who are either marginalized due to race or socioeconomic status. So, ACLU, All Voting is Local Action, Southern Poverty Legal Center, Common Cause, Legal and Voters, all of our groups have really been involved in this effort to some degree to come up with a proactive vision, a proactive policy goal that isn't just a wonky tinkery goal, but something that's exciting, something that we can work on over multiple years and animate grassroots partners around, something that would extend protections for voters, but also expand access. Before getting into the bill itself, I want to take one step back. I'm probably just going to diverge from the slides and just, if you don't mind, Natasha. But the full name of the bill is the Harriet T. and Harriet V. Moore Voting Rights Act, Florida Voting Rights Act. And it's important to tell this story. Harriet T. and Harriet V. Moore were both teachers, and they were activists involved with their NAACP in the 1930s. They actually established the Brevard NAACP chapter. So after all white primaries were ruled unconstitutional in 1944, they started registering a lot of voters, a lot of Black voters, hundreds of thousands. And in 1948, Harry then got involved with the Groveland 4 case, where 4 Black men were accused of raping a white woman. And after the men were convicted and sentenced to death, the Moores led a successful campaign to overturn the conviction at the Supreme Court. And Christmas of that year, a bomb was placed under their home by the KKK, and they were killed. So there's a little silver lining to this, though. By the time of their death, Florida had the highest number of registered Black voters in the South. More Black voters were registered in Florida than in any other state. So the naming of this bill is significant, and it's meant to pay tribute to really the icons of the civil rights movement in Florida, as were the sponsors who were chosen for the bill. Senator Geraldine Thompson has been a longtime voting rights champion in the legislature, and we wanted to pick a sort of the new face of civil rights in the Florida legislature for the House, and Representative LaVon Bracy Davis is definitely that. So there's a lot of significance both in the name and who's carrying this bill. It carries a lot of purpose and symbolism. So does the fact that it's being filed at all, though. Florida is the first state in the South to pursue a state VRA, and it's the first red or non-blue state to pursue a VRA. So if we are able to move this forward and pass it, it really would be making history. It's also important to note that it's part of a wave. California, Washington, Oregon, Virginia, New York, Connecticut, all these other states have passed state voting rights act. This isn't an abstract idea. This isn't something out there. It's a very tangible thing that's being done out of necessity by a lot of states. It's also, there are state voting rights acts being considered in Michigan, Maryland, New Jersey. And this is all because back in 2013, the Supreme Court in the Shelby v. Holder decision held that Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, which had the coverage formula for Section 5, they ruled it unconstitutional, basically gutted it, so that Section 5 protections no longer applied. And since Section 5 protections basically required that the DOJ review any policy changes that impact minority voting strength, and that certain jurisdictions, entire states in some cases, in Florida was just 5 counties, be pre-cleared. If any changes that might impact minority voters are taking place, they had to be pre-cleared in those counties. So when you hear the term pre-clearance, that's what it's referring to. So that was gutted by Shelby v. Holder, and then other decisions since then, like Brnovich, have further eroded at the federal protections. Unfortunately, Congress has failed to take action to date. Every year, new efforts get launched. Actually, this week, a new effort got launched, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act was filed. And, another effort's underway, and Congress does need to act. But in the meanwhile, the states are stepping up, and that's what this is. This is largely because without these protections in place, Black voters, Hispanic voters, other marginalized communities have faced more voter suppression legislation, worse local level policies, all designed to erect barriers to vote, unnecessary barriers to vote. In Florida, for example, this has been unnecessary restrictions to vote by mail, restrictions on voter assistance for disabled and elderly voters, restriction on funding to election officials, harsh penalties for third-party voter registration groups, and extreme penalties for non-citizens and returning citizens, and even the creation of an election police office being used for intimidation tactics. So these state VRAs are really an attempt to protect our voters in the absence of much needed federal protections. but it does build on key protections already in the 1965 U.S. Voting Rights Act. The key difference between ours and other states is, well, I'll say there are a few elements that are essential to any state voting rights act, and that's pre-clearance protections, voter intimidation protections, language access protections, and new protections against vote dilution, which basically means any change or policy that's would dilute minority voting strength. So, for example, taking a district and moving a single member district and moving it to an at-large district in a local community. So those are kind of the key tenets or principles or elements to a Voting Rights Act. But the Florida VRA goes beyond that. We have, we make Election Day a holiday. We create same-day voter registration so that people aren't, getting turned away at the polls. Automatic voter registration, so people can just opt out if they don't want to, but they're already registered. Permanent vote by mail requests, so we're not continually having to get people back on the rolls. And I think most importantly, a centralized database for returning citizens, so people aren't being arrested for trying to vote because the state didn't inform them whether they were eligible or not. It also rolls back a lot of bad legislation passed in recent years that I've already kind of spoken about. So that's very important as well. So I'll just say a couple more things and close. We're past the 50th day in the session, which means this bill isn't going to be heard this session, and that's fine. The first goal this year was to get a real solid draft of this bill done. It's a major piece of legislation, so that was a large effort. Second goal was to build the initial coalition around it, from which now it can be expanded. So we started with a small group of groups, and it's going to get much bigger. The third goal was to get every state legislator in the minority caucus signed on as a co-sponsor, and we did that. Every Democrat in the Florida House and Senate co-sponsored this bill. So what happens now? The next step is, again, to build out that coalition further, for everyone to talk to legislators in the district about the need for this, especially our friends on the right, Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter. They all need to support this. The freedom to vote is at the heart of our democracy, and we're committed to dismantling any threats to voter freedom. The Florida Voting Rights Act, in our opinion, would be a gigantic leap forward to protecting voters, removing obstacles, and expanding voter access. And, you'll be hearing this more and more. We need the Florida Voting Rights Act now. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad, for talking about that exciting news about the Florida Voting Rights Act. Hopefully a lot of the folks that are listening will learn more about it and, speak out about it, because it's really, really important. And if we don't get it moved this session, then hopefully we can do that next session. Okay, so that pretty much concludes our speakers for today. Thank you again to Senator Jones for your inspiring remarks, and thank you to all of our speakers for your impactful presentations that we've seen tonight. For the folks that are watching right now, you might be wondering, after all of this, now that you have all this information, what can you do to make a difference? And the answer to that is a ton, okay? First, you can share this information with your loved ones, your friends, your neighbors, anyone you think cares about the future of our state. And that's because our voices matter in this debate and in this conversation, and we have to make them heard. Now, to that point, the most important thing that you can do is to make sure that you're registered to vote. That's priority number one, right? The best way that you can make your voice heard and to fight back against the folks that might not want to hear about it is to make sure that you're registered. Make sure that the folks that you know are registered to vote, and that all of you have a plan to cast your ballot in your upcoming elections. So how do you do that? I invite you to visit makeaplantovote.com today. Okay. At makeaplantovote.com, you can check your registration status. So even if you think you're registered, double check, make sure. You can sign up to vote by mail, or you can also find your polling place to vote early or on election day in your next election. At the end of the day, it's up to all of us to stay informed about our voting options and to ensure that our vote counts. So when you've made sure that you've registered to vote and have a plan to vote, your next call to action is to visit ourvoicesfl.org. That's ourvoicesfl.org. to explore resources and find information on civil rights advocacy in our state, because we need everybody talking about civil rights in our state. Every single one of you can be a messenger talking about it. And that's because in a state where our freedom to learn, let's be honest, our freedom to exist and our freedom to thrive is constantly under attack, we can fight back by exercising our freedom to vote and make a difference. And with that, thank you so much for joining us tonight and being a part of this discussion and being a part of the solution as we build a Florida where everyone, no matter where we're from, no matter the color of our skin or who we love, has the freedom to be healthy, prosperous, and safe. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much.